Owen Paterson has resigned as the Conservative MP for North Shropshire. In a statement, he said, "I will remain a public servant, but outside the cruel world of politics." These are the events that led to his decision and to a frantic 24 hours. Here is Owen Paterson. While an MP, he was receiving £100,000 a year to be a consultant to two companies. That's allowed under parliamentary rules, but Mr Paterson didn't stick to all of the rules. An investigation by the Independent Standards Committee found that he'd repeatedly lobbied ministers and officials on behalf of those two companies. Its report says the committee found that Mr Paterson's actions were an egregious case of paid advocacy and that he repeatedly used his privileged position to benefit two companies for whom he was a paid consultant. It recommended a suspension of 30 sitting days in Parliament. Such a suspension has to be approved by a vote in Parliament. Normally those votes go through. Not this time. Boris Johnson and his government decided the process hadn't been fair.
Instead of playing politics on this issue, which is what they are doing, I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness.
So, rather than accept the process and accept the outcome, the Prime Minister and his colleagues decided to change the entire way that parliamentary standards are regulated. All of this would be done through an amendment put forward by the Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom. She made the case for a review of how all of this works.
That select committee, which will be politically balanced, so it's not some kind of, conservative thing, it's politically balanced. It will review the process, as I say, of fairness and accountability.
The leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, was fully supportive and argued that this was about more than Owen Paterson's situation.
I think the reason it has come now is because of the volume of complaints that have come through and the more widespread feeling of unfairness across all benches.
Nonetheless, as Mr Rees-Mogg acknowledged, Owen Paterson's situation had prompted the government to act, and it did so with the support of the vast majority of its MPs.
The ayes to the right, 250. The noes to the left, 232.
There were calls of shameful as the vote went through, and this would mean two things. A whole new system would have to be created, and however long that took, Owen Paterson would avoid any action for his egregious case of paid advocacy. Mr Paterson welcomed the news.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister and to Jacob Rees-Mogg, Andrea Leadsom and all those colleagues who did vote for this. They will have taken a political hit, but we will at last now be able to create a proper system based on the rules of natural justice.
Mr Paterson was grateful, but not all Conservatives had supported this. The MP Angela Richardson said she had abstained on the Leadsom amendment today, aware that my job was at risk and it was a matter of principle for me. Later, she was sacked from her role working with the Cabinet Minister Michael Gove. More on this aspect of the story in a minute. And while Boris Johnson and his MPs considered what they'd done, some newspapers were preparing to take aim. The Daily Mail went for "Shameless MP sink back into sleaze." Another went for "Sleazy does it." And then there was this from the chair of the Committee on Standards for Public Life, Lord Evans.
The political system in this country does not belong to one party or even to one government. It is a common good that we have all inherited from our forebears and that we all have a responsibility to preserve and to improve.
By the time Thursday morning arrived, the criticism had moved up a further gear. In an editorial for The Guardian, the opposition Labour leader, Keir Starmer, accused the government of corruption. And on the BBC's Today programme, the Labour MP Chris Bryant, who chairs the Common Standards Committee, put it this way.
Some people yesterday decided, and this is the definition of injustice, that at the very last minute, for a named individual, they would change the rules. That is not what we do in this country. It's what they do in Russia.
The government, though, was holding its position. Also talking to Nick Robinson on the Today programme was the government minister, Kwasi Kwarteng.
What the vote yesterday was about was trying to bring back or bring a sense of fairness, a right of appeal, which Owen Paterson didn't have.
As well as talking about fairness, in another interview with Sky News, Mr Kwarteng said it's difficult to see what the future of the Commissioner is, given the fact that we're reviewing the process and we're overturning and trying to reform this whole process. But it's up to the Commissioner to decide her position. That's right, Catherine Stone, who'd carried out the job that was asked of her, whose report was approved by a cross-party committee of MPs, was now being asked to consider her position. And while we all considered the government's approach to parliamentary standards, early afternoon, that approach changed.
While there is a very strong feeling on both sides of the House that there is a need for an appeals process, there is equally a strong feeling that this should not be based on a single case or applied retrospectively.
And this was the leader of the opposition reacting.
What they've done is corrupt. And often in a situation like this, you have a prime minister who is trying to lead on public standards. What you've got with this prime minister is a prime minister who is leading his troops through the sewer.
It seems the government's sudden change of tack came as a surprise to the man in the middle of all of this. Early afternoon, John Stevens of the Daily Mail tweeted, Number 10 didn't tell Owen Paterson it was performing a U-turn. He was in the supermarket when he found out he was no longer off the hook in a call from the BBC journalist Laura Kunsberg. We also got an update from Angela Richardson. Remember the MP who'd lost her job working with Michael Gove? She told us, pleased to be reappointed to my role. And so, for the moment, the standard system remains in Parliament. But Owen Paterson does not. He released a statement saying he'd been repeatedly and publicly questioned and claiming he was totally innocent of breaking lobbying rules. The problem being that that isn't for Mr Paterson to decide. In normal circumstances, that falls to the Standards Committee. And despite the efforts of Boris Johnson and his colleagues, for now it still does. Which means that while Mr Paterson talks of choosing to continue public service outside the cruel world of politics, and Boris Johnson pays tribute to a friend and colleague, it remains the case that Mr Paterson was found responsible for an egregious case of paid advocacy. And when he was unable to avoid the recommended punishment, he chose to walk away, as have the Conservatives, and the idea of changing the standard system, for the moment at least.